Okay guys, I just wanted to jump in as I work and show you where a common problem occurs. So I finished the sort of frontal outline here. What I see often with student work at this phase is that they just start beginning to round the corners here, but if you look from the side, I still have a totally parallel set of faces. So when I say I don't want to see the block you cast from, that means I did cut off all of the walls here, right? Like the initial square of the cast is not visible, but the initial depth of the pour is totally visible. So my next phase here is not to come in and start rounding these corners because I don't actually have a dynamic shape from the side. So I have the beginnings of my shape from the front. I'm going to come back in with my pencil and draw the form that I might want to see from the side. So for me, these sort of fingers are going to come forward and then curve and then so sort of reach forward and recede, and then a sort of palm shape will flesh back out at the center. This sort of thummy thing will also reach kind of forward, kind of like a three-fingered hand. So my kind of starting place with my abstraction was some kind of concept of openness or friendliness or guilelessness. So the sort of dopey three-fingered cartoon hand, or reference a little bit. It won't be that in the end, but it will have that sort of openness and reachingness of that, like a Mickey hand or something. And so those fingers will come forward, the knuckle will come back, and what I'm thinking of is the palm will come and flesh that out again. But I will need to now work in from these faces. So I've been working primarily right now with my block down on the table, working to chisel down the sides, sometimes coming in to a valley and working into those voids that are a little harder to get just from the front. But I just wanted to pause and say this is where the extruded drawing problem comes from, is when a student has roughed out their form and then starts in on a finished surface at this point before they've really worked out the form from another side. Okay, so I'll pause and show you as that goes along. Oh, I do also want to say this is an exhausting process. I'm aware your elbow gets tired from the hammer. So one thing to think about as you're hammering is letting the weight of the hammer do some of the work. So rather than this gesture, rather this with the sort of hammer weight dropping down onto the chisel. But it will just be tiring no matter what. Okay, I just wanted to check in now. I've started coming in from the sides. I drew out this sort of finger form from one side. Of course, it's different from the other, so I'm following this outline that I've drawn on the outside of my initial reduction, the first design I cut out of the block. Now I'm modifying it from different sides. I'm still not really at a place quite transformed yet. You can still see this very flat surface on either side where my block was initially cast. So I think I'm going to try to hollow this out, which is a bit of an awkward proposition, but I'm sure those of you at home have figured out how you do that. Just going to show you some ways of doing that. It's basically like digging a hole where I'm chopping first from one side, just lodging my chisel, and then chopping from the other. Kind of wedging under the material until I finally have a little hole I can work my way down into. Even so, I think even if I'm going to hollow out that whole front surface, I want to make sure that there's some variation in the height of that palm shape so that it doesn't end up looking just as uniform with a curve in it as this block started out. So I'm really trying to work back from all of my edges to make sure from every side there is some degree of dynamism, some visual interest and transformation from my initial block. You'll notice that also my carving is really blocky. That's obviously a result of working from one direction and then the other. I'm still roughing this out. There's no point before you have the shape to begin to smooth the corners. It's really tempting because it's really satisfying, but this is still so far from my ultimate dimensions. I really just need to keep roughing it out until I can finally see what my final form is. I'm not suffering too badly from air bubbles, but you can imagine if you had a lot of air in your cast, that when you finally did get down to your final surface, you might find I have an air bubble right here. I don't think this camera is really great, but if that was my final surface, I would probably just keep sanding a little past that to get away from that air bubble that creates a crater. Okay, back to work. Okay, so I spent some time contouring the areas that were still showing evidence of the face of my block. You still see that there are some suspiciously repeated depths here, right? This protrusion is the same depth as this protrusion, is the same depth as this protrusion. It tells the story of the original block that I cast. So I still have some work to do to get this into a truly transformed state. You can tell that it probably, if I put it face down, wouldn't really wobble that much, right? Because it's the same face I started with nearly. Same is true of the back. I'm glad I put it in those terms because I was wondering what was frustrating me about this series of kind of folds in the back. It's that they all kind of reach a similar height from this dimension. So I'm close enough to the form that I want. I might take one or two of these points. This I do intend to bring back. This I do intend to round significantly. But as you can see, every single face of my block has been significantly radically altered. Mine is a relatively massive shape. I left these to be, these are about like 1.25 inches thick. I probably will make them thinner, but as I was working with a chisel pretty aggressively, I didn't want to make them so thin that they'd be brittle and stand to crack as I sort of rotated and repositioned this as I worked. But now that I'm getting a little closer to my form, I will begin to taper those. I'm at a place that I feel isn't too far from the shape I ultimately want this to be. I like the way that these 3 points seem to kind of end at different places in space. I think maybe this could be a little less thick as I go along. Fixed some of those problems of depth, repetitive depth. I was mentioning in the last video that I felt that I kind of carved both front and back into quadrants, and I felt that their height was a little too similar across the whole face. I've sort of brought some forward, or left some forward and brought some back in order to create some difference in these heights. So I'm at a place now where my roughing out might be pretty close to done. Looking at this in the video, I'm slightly suspicious of the quadrants in the front. I might work to deepen that, I'm not really sure. But my next phase is going to be to start smoothing this form. You see I've already started taking some of the edges off the really blocky fingers that will ultimately be a little rounder. I haven't quite resolved on a texture just yet, but I'm going to start working with other tools. I've done all of this so far with a chisel, most of it not with a hammer, most of it just with the pressure of my hand, my body behind the tool. Just really the front profile that I carve with a chisel. But now I'm going to go either in with the carving tools I showed you in the first video to kind of smooth and go deeper into these creases, or I might use abrasive tools like a file, a rasp, sandpaper, or what's called a Sureform. I'll come back and do some of that tomorrow, putting this blade guard back on my chisel, and cleaning up my huge mess. You may have noticed that as you work on this wetter plaster dust, it kind of binds back to your material. It's annoying, but it's not a problem. Just keeping your workplace clear as you work on your piece, the best and only way to avoid that. Okay, I hope your carving's going well.